All right, let's get into it. We're going to talk about a wall today, but not the old school made of stone kind. Nope. We're going digital to look at a pretty wild piece of 21st century engineering, China's Great Firewall, and more importantly, what it tells us about how power works today.
So China's got two really famous walls, right? But what's fascinating is that their whole reason for being is the complete opposite. The ancient Great Wall, that was all about keeping invaders out, bricks, stone, the whole deal. But the Great Firewall, it's built with code and censorship, and its job is to keep its own citizens in. Not physically, of course, but mentally. It's this invisible barrier that walls off the Chinese internet from pretty much the rest of the planet.
So why go to all that trouble? Well, the source material we're looking at says the goal is to create something called a civilizational lowland. Okay, stick with me here. Think of ideas and civilization like water. It always wants to flow downhill, from a high point to a low point. By building this digital wall, the state can basically stop the flow of modern ideas about things like democracy and individual rights, keeping the population in a sort of controlled, isolated environment. And this whole setup, this digital wall, is really the foundation for what some have called a perfect dictatorship. It's a system where you don't always need tanks in the streets, because the most effective control has become an inside job.
In fact, Oxford professor Stein Ringen felt that a plain old word like autocracy just didn't cut it anymore. He came up with a new term, controlocracy. And it describes a system where state control is so total that it kind of outsources the work of enforcement to the citizens themselves. People are basically conditioned to police their own thoughts and the thoughts of everyone around them. This quote really gets to the core of it. Being a slave in body, being born into a system you have zero control over, that's a tragedy. It's about your circumstances. But becoming a slave in heart, where you actively help maintain your own prison, that's presented as something else entirely. It's a deeper kind of captivity, one that often grows out of massive social pressure and just not seeing any other way to live.
So what does this actually look like day to day? Well, people start to self-censor. They just know which topics you don't talk about. They might even report their friends or neighbors for saying the wrong thing. And then there's this weird psychological twist, where people can become the fiercest defenders of the very system that's boxing them in. They effectively become unpaid security guards for the state, not because they're evil, but often just as a way to survive. Okay, so what happens to the human mind when it grows up inside this civilizational lowland? What's the long-term result of living your life in this highly curated, walled-off garden of information? The source material uses a really striking term to describe the result, the adult infant, and it's exactly what it sounds like. We're talking about people who are chronologically adults, but whose critical thinking skills, their ability to analyze the world, have been intentionally kept underdeveloped by a very controlled diet of information. And you can kind of see the recipe for how this happens right here. Step 1, information starvation. You only get state-approved, filtered news. That leads to step 2, simplified thinking. The world gets boiled down to simple, black and white stories because that's all you're given. From there, it's a really short jump to step 3, emotional reasoning, where nationalist slogans and propaganda are super effective. And the end result? Step 4, parental dependence. People start to look at the state as a parent figure that has all the answers and will solve all their problems. But here's the thing. No wall is perfect. No system is completely seamless. A system this rigid, it's got to have some weaknesses. So how do people find a way out? How does any light get in? For the millions of people who refuse to be slaves in heart, the answer to that is a huge, resounding no. It's not easy, and there are definitely risks, but a ton of people are actively working to see past that digital barrier every single day. They even have a name for it, climbing the wall. People use tools like VPNs to get around the firewall, but this is so much more than just a technical workaround to get on Twitter. Every time someone successfully climbs that wall, it's this deeply personal act of rebellion. It's a mental prison break. It's choosing to see an unfiltered reality for yourself. And this quote just captures it perfectly. The system's greatest strength, its rigid, total control, is also its greatest weakness. Because it's so rigid, cracks are bound to show up. And it's through those cracks that unfiltered information, the light, can sneak in and start to change how a person sees everything. So what's the way forward? Well, the source material argues against these big, grand ideas of saving the nation. The kind of stuff that sounds great but can be easily hijacked or just lead to chaos. Instead, it pushes for a much more personal and maybe even more powerful idea, saving yourself. The logic here is as simple as it gets. It's like the safety briefing on an airplane, right? You have to put on your own oxygen mask first before you can help anyone else. You can't help enlighten other people if you're still sitting in the dark. So this idea of self-rescue, it isn't selfish. It's the absolute first, most essential step. It's about building your own knowledge, strengthening your own mind, before you can be any good to anybody else.
So I guess the big takeaway is this. Real, meaningful change doesn't always kick off with some massive revolution. Sometimes it starts with a quiet, courageous act of one person deciding to climb a wall, just so they can see the world for themselves. Which leaves us with a pretty important question to think about. In any world of walls, digital or otherwise, what does it really mean to save yourself first?